Welcome to Economics 310. This is the last segment that I intend to do, at least in a video clip format, for this first week. To sort of be very brief, let me just highlight from the beginning the fact that since we're really talking right now about environmental degradation, it has really a number of components, both political, economic, social, and obviously environmental. Now, in this particular course, we're going to be emphasizing obviously the political. So what is it that environmentalists are really concerned about whenever they talk about this ecological failure? What is it that they really are asking us to do? As I had hinted last time, if you still recall, the problem is so immense and so deep that it really, from my point of view, and obviously the point of view of very many other environmentalists, it does require what is known as a paradigm shift. This is a total way of thinking, because the problem really is systemic. That's to say, you require a change of the whole system. And this is what I was referring to last time when I spoke about the architecture, about how is it that the architecture needs to be changed. Now, obviously, those of you who come from an environmental background have discussed very many of these ideas before, but those that are economics majors, many of these ideas might be sort of novel to them. So my recommendation is that you go ahead and you read these 4 chapters very closely. You pay attention to all of the concepts. Make sure that the few things that we have spoken about before are also very clear. And we will, as time goes on, probably make certain references to very many of these ideas. But let me give you, by the way, before we go ahead, a very simple example of what I mean by a paradigm shift. The most radical view of environmentalism is that which is known as deep ecology. In deep ecology, you speak of the intrinsic value, while from the purely mainstream cornucopian point of view, you really speak of instrumental value. And as a result, as you'll find out, almost everything is going to go in opposite directions from here. Because when you believe in intrinsic value, then what we're really suggesting is that you will not go ahead and abuse nature. And if you're not going to abuse nature, you're not going to be very much interested in growth, for growth's sake. While from the point of view of cornucopian, when it's really the instrumental value that is important, then actually you believe really in unlimited growth. And that is essentially, as well as probably many of you know, is the issue. Do we want to go ahead and place a lid on growth? Or actually, we speak these days in Europe much more than in the United States about degrowth. That's to say, we have grown too far, too fast. And we should actually right now adopt a policy of degrowth in order to move back to what I called last time sustainable economics, steady state economics. So as you can see, the differences are really huge. And therefore, your total attitude, your vision of the world must change in order to deal with these problems, if you're going to deal with them in a meaningful way. So what are the major critiques of environmentalists when they speak about mainstream economics? And mainstream economics is obviously right now, the universal economics, let's say it's the economics that is very popular and that has determined the current paradigm all over the world, at least for the past 200, 300 years, maybe even more. You could even take it probably as far back as some people would like to go 250 or 300 years. But the fact of the matter is, economics as we know it, as we all well know, really goes back to Smith. Modern economics is really Smithian economics. So notice that there are really four things that environmentalists try to really critique. The first thing, always and forever, is that they critique the circular flow. The circular flow diagram is the diagram, the conception of mainstream economics, of how the economy runs. What is the dynamic behind the economy? The second thing that is often critiqued is national income accounting. They say that the national income accounting that we have really needs to be also changed, and it's flawed. These are two concepts. This is really in chapter 1 and 2, and this is chapter 8. So we're going to discuss these in slightly greater details. Then the other critique will be market failure, which is going to be the subject of the next week, and possibly if we find out that we need to even spend some more time from the third week, we'll do that, because market failure is also one of the most important things. And the fourth basic idea that is critiqued by the environmentalists whenever they try to refute the way that we do economics from the mainstream perspective is the issue of valuation. How do you value something that doesn't have a market? How do you value the environment? How do you value a tree, fresh air, clean water, and so on and so forth? So again, this will be the subject that we're going to deal with of at least 1 week. And if, again, we find out that we will spend a little bit more than a week. So let's go back right now to the circular flow. Now, as I had again mentioned in the previous video clip, those of you who have the economic background are going to find out that this is really very simple, but for the sake of those that really do not have the economic background, it behooves us to go over it very quickly to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So whenever we speak about mainstream economics, normally the first thing that you talk about, you'll find out in every single textbook, and people use it, by the way, even for in preparation for their PhD, because our view of the world, of the economy, is represented by a so-called circular flow diagram. I mean, very simply stated what it is. It really is nothing else but the way that we think that the world runs. So if a Martian is going to make an appearance and ask you how does the economy of planet Earth run, what you say is that essentially, this is definitely a little bit simplified, but I'm not going to be able to deal with, speak about all the details, but we say really that we have essentially two sectors, the business sector and the household sector. The household sector supplies all the factors of production to the business sector. The businesses take all the factors of production and they transform them into goods and services. Now, there is no money if you look only at these two flows. The problem, however, is that in a society such as ours, almost everything, all forms of exchange are based on money. So what we say, therefore, is that we sell our factors of production to the businesses for an income. And then we take that income and we spend it on the goods and services. So for those of you who have not thought about this previously, the very popular concept that we talk about very often, the GDP. What is the GDP? The GDP is really nothing else but the value of the goods and services. So it's the value of this loop. That's to say, it's the total expenditures. which are equal, obviously, if this is going to be a circular flow, are going to be equal to all the income. So very simply, by the way, what are the factors of production? Again, I don't want to spend that much time on them, but just as a quick reminder, the factors of production are land, labor, and capital. However, we have added over the past 60 or 70 years entrepreneurship. So right now, entrepreneurship is looked upon as being also a factor of production. So these are the factors of production that we sell. Now, why do we sell them, by the way? Because we own them. So notice this, although it doesn't speak about it, is really based on the institution of private property. It assumes that the households own all of these factors of production. And where do we sell them? How do we know the price? The price is determined in the market. So there are markets over here for land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, and they determine what is the price. Then businesses produce the 100 million different goods and services, and there are also markets that determine the price of each of these goods and services. So these are nothing else but the expenditures. What do we pay land? We pay land rent, labor gets wages, capital gets interest, and the entrepreneurs get the economic profit. Now, forgetting right now the implications, economic implications of this, why is it that the environmentalists disagree with it? Well, for a very simple reason. They say it's not realistic. Why isn't it realistic? Well, all what they have to do is just ask one question. Where is the environment? Are there any limits to this? And obviously the answer is that there are no limits, as you can see, because there is no environment. And so this economy over here can keep on reproducing itself. There's nothing to apply any limits on it. And so therefore you can have implicitly what? Limitless growth. You can keep on growing forever. But as we all well know, whether the subject has been discussed in some of your previous classes or not, over the past, ever since the Great Recession in 2008, you'll find out that almost every other popular article, even in the mainstream press, it doesn't have to be in an economic journal, really speaks about the fact that, hey, maybe we really have got to start considering right now what are the limits that are being applied, and maybe we cannot grow forever. And actually very many people right now are suggesting that actually we might have reached the peak of growth. Again, we'll touch upon that later on. So what do they do, therefore, the environmentalists, in order to counter this particular model? They say, okay, so let's go ahead and look at production. And what do we find out? One can, therefore, have a linear production by saying that we produce consumer goods that we go ahead and we consume. This is for utility's sake. Because in mainstream economics, the single thing that is important is the maximization of utility. That's to say satisfaction. Anything that will satisfy the consumer is going to be kosher. But this, again, doesn't have anything about resources. So we want to, therefore, make it more realistic, therefore we add the resources. So what we can say, therefore, is that the natural resources are used in order to have the process of production, to produce the consumer goods, and then obviously you'll be able to speak about utility. I mean, this is definitely a little bit also simplified because you can always add over here capital. But it's no big deal. So production produces capital, and the capital is going to produce consumer goods, and the consumer goods are for utility's sake. Now, this is a little bit more realistic, as you can see, but it still doesn't answer one issue that is very important to environmentalists. Can we produce without waste? Where is waste? And as you can see, that can be added to the model very simply. So I can say resources are used to produce, and the production into consumer goods that we'll use them. But at each stage, we're going to be producing some waste. So we'll have the waste of the resources, the waste of production, and the waste of the consumer goods. This is where this becomes very important and very tricky. because of a concept that I hope all of you definitely, one must assume that we all remember it because you've run across it sometime in your high school. The first law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is saying really that nothing can be created or destroyed, neither energy nor matter. Now what are the implications of this, therefore? Now notice the great implication. The implication of this is that resources eventually are what? Total waste. So if you add up all the wastes, they will be equal to the total waste, which will be equal to the resources. So our process of production, therefore, is absolutely nothing else but creating waste. And this is the first law of thermodynamics. Because all what we do is that we transfer things from one form to another. We cannot get rid of them. There is no way, since nothing can be created and nothing can be destroyed. And this is one of the single most important, obviously, scientific principles. So as you can see, this is not a philosophical issue, but we're saying that this process of production, the way that we can view it in this case, including the waste, is really subject to the first law of thermodynamics. But that is not enough, because depending again on how much science that you have studied, you'll find out that another important law that is considered to be one of the single most important laws in science is the second law of thermodynamics. There is a word that is attached to the second law of thermodynamics that is known as entropy. I don't want to take any time right now and discuss entropy at length, but it really essentially means that you can't recycle everything, because as you are producing, you're going to be losing some energy that can never be recaptured. So let's see if we can show the second law of thermodynamics in a very small, sketchy model of our production that will be much more realistic than this production, than this circular flow. So we have resources, we produce consumer goods, we will be creating waste. But what happens to the waste? Well, the waste is going to go into the environment. So the environment, therefore, is very crucial, because the environment is going to act as a waste sink. Without the environment, we wouldn't be able to continue this particular process, because something has got to act as a waste sink. So the environment plays, therefore, an extremely crucial role when it comes to the issue of production, to economics. But not all waste goes into the environmental sink. And this is what I referred to, if you still recall, I hope you do, in one of the clips that I spoke about, is the issue of scale. If it so happens that, let's assume, let's talk about the Hudson, since we're very close to the Hudson. If the Hudson can purify, say for the sake of the argument, 10,000 barrels of waste every day that are thrown into it. So if, for one reason or another, we have certain production facilities around the Hudson, and we throw into the Hudson only 100 barrels of waste every day, then that's no problem, because that is going to be within the absorptive capacity of the Hudson. But once we build a capacity that's going to dump into the Hudson, say 20,000 barrels of waste a day, and the Hudson can really handle only 10,000, then we have a big problem. So scale over here becomes very huge. And this is very simply really the reason why is it this awareness of environmentalism is relatively recent. That's why we didn't really worry about it, say 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But you see, part of the waste is going to be recycled, small r. And by being recycled, it goes back into the natural resources, and so the whole process starts all over again. However, the second law is saying that this small r is only a fraction of the big R. So the waste that we produce, we cannot recycle all of them. Only a very minute point. But it isn't only because of technology. There are physical limits. Nothing can be recycled 100%. It just cannot be done because of the law of entropy. And this is what I meant, by the way, when I said, and it's a very important phrase, the more we do, the less we have. Because the more that we're going to be producing, the greater is going to be the garbage heap, and we'll be able to recycle only part of the garbage heap, and therefore the environment will have to act as a sink. But we will get to that point whereby the environment wouldn't be able to operate any longer because of all the wastes that have been dumped into it. An excellent example really of the application of entropy, and we'll talk about it later on, will be when we speak about energy, and in particular the non-renewable energy. So as you can see, what we're really suggesting is that the circular flow, the way that mainstream economics looks at it, at its basis, is flawed, because it doesn't take into consideration any limits. Once you take into consideration these limits, then you'll find out that we have no choice but to consider scale and to think about limits, and actually eventually we'll have to think even about this issue of steady state, i.e. sustainability. The other thing, as you can see, that is directly related to this, obviously, is the issue of national income accounting. Again, I mean, I don't want to really right now go ahead and spend lots of time on this. Many of you, especially if you've taken economics before, but even those who haven't taken economics, you deal with it in the first course of environmentalism when you speak about the GDP. The GDP is really calculated according to certain definitions. So what we're saying right now, the environmentalists, is that these definitions that are being used in order to calculate the GDP are deceiving. Because what is a very small, quick definition for a GDP, which we've used earlier, is the value of all the goods and services that are being produced. Now let me ask you a very simple thing in order to make this very quick. Do we produce only goods? Or do we produce bads at the same time? We produce both goods and bads. The GDP adds everything, but does not subtract the bads. So what environmentalists are suggesting is that if this national income accounting that we are using gives us the wrong impression, we think that we are growing, because when we do the computation, we find out that our GDP is growing. But our GDP is growing according to this, not because of real growth, it's a fictitious growth, because it does not adjust for the bads. Let me give you a very simple example, just in case you haven't thought of it. Let's assume that I can create a society and pass a law suggesting that every single person must hold a job that is at least, say, 300 miles away from where they live. What would that do? I mean, I haven't done any calculation, but I imagine since transportation is around 20% of the GDP, this will probably double the GDP. Why? Because then every person will have to drive to an airport, to take an airplane, or maybe a train in order to get to work, and then spend another 3 or 4 hours to get back home. So you spend around 8 hours every day to just commute back and forth from work. It would appear, therefore, since you're going to need more airplanes and more highways and more airports and more trains and what have you, that the GDP is going to increase. But has the quality of life increased? Of course it hasn't. So yes, you can, you can make it appear as if things have grown, when actually the quality of life has really deteriorated. Another very popular example that is used by economists, and some of you might have heard it before, will be that of cigarette smoking. What if we pass a law saying that every single person, as soon as they turn 15, will have to start smoking, say, 2 packs a day? What will happen? Then the incidence of lung cancer will increase substantially. We'll have to build all sorts of hospitals and undertake all sorts of operations and what have you. So you can find out then, at least theoretically, that the value of these operations will increase. But are these really adding anything to the quality of life? And the answer obviously is not. So what they do over here is that they say, okay, let's adjust the GDP. We will add certain things that the GDP is not adding that we should add. A very simple thing, by the way, will be the services of a housewife. The services of a housewife do not get computed into the GDP. We found out, by the way, according to certain studies, that in order to replace the services of a housewife, to do all the cleaning and the cooking and tending for baby and what have you, you'd need to hire somebody for around, say, $70,000 a year. So if you're going to have, say, for the sake of the argument, 50 million is a little bit too much, say 10 million traditional housewives, go ahead, therefore, and multiply 10 million times 70,000, and you'll find out that the GDP would need to increase really abnormally. So there are certain things that we do not add that should be added, but at the same time, there are so many things that we add that should be subtracted. For example, all the defensive expenditures, starting from car wrecks to the climate change to the pollution of water and so on and so forth. So there are a number of procedures that have really been suggested to do that, and you can do your own. The important thing is not to accept the straightforward definitions of the GDP. Economists, by the way, do not disagree with that. Actually, very many economists are on the side of the environmentalists over here, because many economists have been arguing about the fact that since the GDP really is nothing else but a definition, every once in a while we need to revisit these things and adjust these definitions. But the important thing over here, the most important to me at least, is one that is called the ISEW. The ISEW was suggested for the first time by Herman Daly and one of his co-authors by the name of Cobb. And what they did is that they agreed on a very large list of items that should be added and a very large list of items that should be subtracted. But the important thing is that they found out that the GDP has peaked for the developed world, by the way. The GDP of the developed world has peaked in the early to the mid-80s. And these studies have been done for Australia, for Germany, for Italy, for the United States, obviously, for England, for Sweden, for India, and a number of other countries. And in every single case, if you apply these adjustments over here, you'll find out that what appears to be growth is not growth. That's to say, you'll find out that the GDP as calculated increases like this, but once you do the adjustment, the ISEW, you get to the 1980-85 and it either moves sideways and in some cases it actually moves downwards. And this is again what I had referred to earlier in a previous clip by Daly. He says that the world is full. That's to say, we can't produce any more right now. So what we're really doing is that we're kidding ourselves by thinking that we are producing some more. So with this, I'll I'll bid you farewell and hope to see you. I'll see you next week for the next assignment. Read these 4 chapters, pay attention to the details, and as I suggested before, if you have some important questions that you can't find the answer to, send me an email and we'll see what we can do about it. Okay? Bye-bye.